Israel had just experienced this incredible victory against Jericho. The walls came tumbling down, and God had only given them this simple command: as you go in, do not take any of the devoted things for yourselves. Well, then chapter 7 starts with this one word. And usually when you hear this word, it means usually that what is next is not really good. And in this case, it's definitely true. After chapter 6 has this incredible victory, chapter 7 starts with the word but. It's kind of like if you go to pick your car up from the shop and you ask them, how did it look? They said, well, everything looked good, but... Or maybe you go to pick your kids up from someone's house where they've been spending the night. You're like, how did everything go? And did they behave? Yeah, they did okay, but whatever's next usually is not good news. And that's exactly what happens here. See, there was another battle that was raging at this time, and it had nothing to do with what was happening in Jericho or even in Ai, but it was happening in the heart of a guy named Achan. See, he decided to take some of those devoted things for himself. And because of that, God's people in chapter 7, a battle that they should have won, they lost. And so yesterday we looked at this cycle of sin and what happens when we experience that initial defeat, that if we keep that defeat to ourselves, disclose it, we'll experience dismay, we'll experience discouragement, but we'll also experience, as we see here in this text, a lack of power. And so yesterday we talked about the importance of those hidden sins in our life and bringing them from a place of shame into a place of healing. And one of the ways that we talked about, of course, by seeing this and looking at this example of Achan, was about bringing it before God and bringing it before other people. Because one of the things that we noticed with the people is that whenever there was this secret sin in the camp, that every single person was going to suffer. That when we keep our sin to ourselves, it doesn't just impact us as we hide in that shame, but it can also impact the way we treat and live with other people. And so that's exactly what had happened with Achan. And so Joshua got him to present the things that he had stolen before God. And I loved how the text says that Achan, when you do this and when you take things from God and when you keep things hidden and you don't confess, you're not respecting God's glory and you're not praising his name. And I love that because when we think of confession, we usually only think of confession as admission, but confession is way more than admission. It's about God's glory. It's about praising his name. It's about our good God's honor. And so then we get to chapter 8, and Israel's kind of starting that chapter like a dog with their tail tucked between its legs. They had just experienced this really bad news. They'd experienced a lot of defeat. But what we saw in this text is that even though it is, yes, a text of somewhat, of judgment, it's also a text of hope. And what we looked at yesterday is that God is pleased to actually turn those defeats we have in our lives into victory. And so we see in chapter 8 that what God needed to do with Joshua and all of the people are these two things: to give them a brand new strategy and to give them a brand new role. And the same thing for us in our lives. In order for us to let God turn our defeats into his victories, sometimes we got to start with a brand new strategy. What we've been doing in the past is not working. Even remember that time when Joshua was down on his knees and he was praying, God said, get up. So he's saying, yes, there's a time to pray, but there's also a time to act. That maybe your strategy before is prayer. Yes, please keep praying, because when our prayers go up, there's power that God gives us. But we also have to understand that there's also a time that we have to act. It's that law of navigation that we talked about yesterday, that's the place where the divine faith of God meets our action, our planning, and our preparation. So maybe for some of you, what you need to do is to come up with some new strategy, because what you're doing is not working. Or maybe for some of you, like Joshua, you're gonna have to take on the new role. And for Joshua, he was having to do stuff in chapter 8 that he had not done previously. But it was through that new role that God blessed him and used him to see what was a time of compromise as a time that God could turn into blessing when things were brought out into the open. So the action step yesterday was basically what James 5:16 talks about, is to confess your sin. And to confess your sin to God so you can experience forgiveness, but confess your sin to other people so you can experience healing. A lot of these action steps on these Made for Mondays I know are rather somewhat maybe simple things. This one's a lot heavier. And while it's very heavy, as we talked about yesterday, it is so incredibly important in order for us to go from a place of shame into a place of healing, a place of isolation and into a place of community. So I want to encourage each of you to confess that sin that's in your life, that thing that you've maybe kept hidden. Confess it to God for forgiveness and confess it to someone so you can experience healing.